You've gotten very good at being alone. You've built a life that requires almost nothing from other people. You screen your calls, you cancel plans without guilt. You've convinced yourself that your solitude is wisdom, that protecting your energy is maturity, that needing nobody is strength. And on the surface, it looks like peace. But here is the psychological warning nobody is giving you directly enough. You are building a prison and calling it a sanctuary.
That landed somewhere uncomfortable for me because I have said out loud that I am an introvert who needs a lot of space, and I believed it completely. But there's a version of that which is true and healthy, and there's another version that is just fear, wherein the language of self-care.
And the difference between those two versions is the most important psychological distinction of our time. Because while you've been locking the world out, carefully, deliberately, with excellent justifications, you've accidentally been locking yourself in. And the window to reconnect, to be truly known by another human being, does not stay open forever.
We live in an era that has handed people the most sophisticated set of tools for avoiding genuine intimacy in human history and called it personal growth. Protect your peace. Not everyone deserves access to you. Choose solitude over bad company. All true, all potentially weaponized into a life where nobody truly knows you.
And here is what that costs. Not socially, not superficially, but at the deepest level of who you are. Today, we are going to go there.
And that's exactly what we're unpacking today on the Wiser Hour.
Welcome to the Wiser Hour. I'm Sophia with Ethan, and today's conversation is one of the most personally confronting we've done because it challenges something the modern self-help world has elevated to near sacred status. The idea that more privacy, more boundaries, more selective silence is always progress.
By the end of this episode, you're going to be able to tell the difference between healthy solitude and psychological hiding. And that distinction might change something real about how you're living right now.
This is urgent because loneliness is now classified by the Surgeon General as a public health epidemic, not despite the fact that people have more tools to connect than ever, but because of how those tools are being used to perform connection without experiencing it.
If this is the kind of conversation you need right now, subscribe to the Wiser Hour. This is what we do every week. All right, let's get into it.
To understand what's happening, we have to go back to something Aristotle said that modern individualism has almost completely inverted. Aristotle didn't just say humans are social creatures as a pleasant observation. He called it our telos, our fundamental purpose and direction. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he wrote that a person who lives without community is either a beast or a god, not an enlightened monk, either less than human or beyond human. No middle ground.
Which is striking because the entire modern wellness conversation positions radical self-sufficiency as the pinnacle of emotional health. I don't need anyone has become aspirational.
And Aristotle would have found that not admirable, but tragic, because for him, eudaimonia, genuine human flourishing, was not achievable in isolation. It required witnesses. It required people who knew your character across time, who saw your failures and your growth, who could hold the continuity of your story when your own memory of yourself became distorted.
That phrase, witnesses to your life, I keep coming back to it because there's something that happens when nobody is watching your actual life, not your curated life, your real one.
The philosopher Charles Taylor called it the buffered self, a modern identity that has erected such thick walls between the inner life and the outside world that genuine contact with others becomes nearly impossible. Taylor argued this wasn't freedom, it was impoverishment, because the self is not a fixed object you protect behind glass. The self is something that forms, deepens, and becomes real through contact with others.
So what you're saying is, the more completely I separate myself from others in the name of protecting who I am, the less who I am actually develops.
The Stoics understood something subtle here that gets lost in modern privacy culture. Marcus Aurelius, who valued inner life as much of anyone, still wrote extensively about duty to community, about showing up, about the obligation to remain in genuine contact with the people around him. His privacy was interior. It was the quality of his inner reflection. But his life was not private. He remained present, visible, known.
The Stoics drew a line we've collapsed between solitude of mind and withdrawal of self. You can be internally composed without being socially absent, but today we're treating those as the same thing.
And here is the radical insight that most privacy is healing content will never tell you. The fear driving your need for privacy is almost never about other people. It is about being seen and found insufficient. The walls are not keeping the world out. They are keeping your authentic self in, hidden, untested, and therefore permanently uncertain of its own worth.
So it's not really needing space, it's about fearing the verdict that genuine contact might deliver.
And what's extraordinary is that modern neuroscience and psychology have mapped exactly what happens to identity when that verdict is perpetually avoided.
So what does the science actually say?
There is a concept in narrative psychology called the self as a story, developed by psychologist Dan McAdams, and it holds something deeply important. McAdams found that humans don't experience their lives as a sequence of events. We experience our lives as a story we are telling ourselves about who we are. And like any story, it requires an audience to remain coherent.
That stopped me when I first encountered it, because I always assumed self-knowledge was purely internal, that if I just reflected enough, journaled enough, meditated enough, I would know myself clearly. But you're saying that's not the whole picture.
That's exactly what the research says. McAdams found that without external witnesses, without people who know your story across time, who can reflect back inconsistencies, growth, patterns you can't see from inside your own perspective, the self-narrative begins to thin. It becomes repetitive. It calcifies around a fixed identity rather than evolving. The person who shares nothing with no one does not develop a richer inner life. They develop a more rigid one.
And I think that's the part privacy culture genuinely misses. You go inward expecting to find more of yourself, but without the friction of genuine contact with others, you end up with less. You just recycle the same thoughts about the same version of yourself indefinitely.
The psychologist John Cacioppo, who spent decades studying loneliness at the University of Chicago, found something that should alarm anyone who treats hypervigilant privacy as self-care. He discovered that chronic loneliness does not just affect emotional well-being, it activates what he called the threat vigilance system, the brain's danger detection mechanism, and keeps it permanently elevated. Lonely brains, his research showed, perceive social situations as more threatening than they actually are. They interpret ambiguous signals as hostile. They expect rejection before it happens.
So the very isolation that was supposed to protect you from being hurt actually makes you more sensitized to the possibility of being hurt, which drives more isolation.
It becomes self-reinforcing. Cacioppo called it the loneliness loop. The more you retreat, the more threatening connection feels, which justifies more retreat, until eventually the walls aren't a choice anymore. They're a reflex.
And I think the hyper-individualist language around this makes it almost impossible to recognize from the inside, because every step deeper into isolation gets labeled as protecting my energy, or knowing my limits, or not settling for low-quality connection. The framing is always positive.
Brené Brown's research on vulnerability named this directly. She found that the people in her studies who described themselves as most private, who were proudest of their boundaries and their selectivity, were also disproportionately the ones who described feeling the least known. Not the least exposed, the least known. There is a profound difference. Exposure is being seen. Being known is being understood over time. And you cannot be known without allowing someone sustained, honest access to who you actually are.
The least known, not the least exposed. I want to sit with that because I think a lot of us have confused those two things completely. We protected ourselves from exposure and called it being known on our own terms, but we were actually just invisible.
And the cost of that invisibility, of never being truly witnessed, is what McAdams described as the thinning of the self. Your identity requires other people to hold parts of it. When no one holds any part of you, when your story has no audience, it begins to fade even to you. You lose the thread of your own narrative.
Have you ever had the experience of being around people for hours and feeling more alone afterward than before? That experience has a name, and it's not introversion. Drop it in the comments.
So now the question becomes, if the walls aren't working, what actually does?
That's the part I've been waiting for.
The shift I want to offer isn't be more open as a general instruction, because that's useless and anxiety-inducing. What I want to offer is a different architecture entirely. Not fewer walls, different walls. The Stoics called this the distinction between what is up to us and what is not. Your interior life, your values, your responses, your judgment, that is yours to protect completely. But your presence, your story, your willingness to be witnessed, that is what you were made to offer.
And I want to name what makes this genuinely difficult, because it's not laziness. For a lot of people, the retreat into privacy happened after something real. A betrayal, a humiliation, a moment where being fully seen led to being fully hurt. And the brain learned visibility equals danger. Rewiring that isn't a matter of just deciding to be more open.
Which is why the first practice is what I call graduated witness. You do not need to open your full self to the world. You need one person, one, who knows a true thing about you that you haven't told anyone else. Not your deepest wound necessarily, just something real, something unperformed. Research consistently shows that the depth of one genuine relationship does more for psychological health than a wide network of surface connections. Start with one honest conversation. That is the beginning of being known.
Okay, but this one requires something most people haven't done, actually identifying what a true thing is. Because when you've been performing okayness for long enough, you lose track of where the performance ends and the real thing begins.
Which brings us to the second practice, narrative recovery. Dan McAdams' research generated a specific exercise. Write the story of your life in 3 chapters and share it with someone who matters to you. Not as a confession, as a story. Because the act of constructing a coherent narrative of who you've been and offering it to a witness, that is how the self stops thinning and starts deepening again. The Bible understood this long before psychology did. Ecclesiastes 4:9 says, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. The person who has no witness has no one to help them back to themselves.
The one most people skip is the sharing. They'll do the journaling, they'll write the story, but showing it to another person, that's where the fear lives, because that's where the verdict could come.
And the third practice is the hardest and most necessary, what I call chosen exposure. Once a week, share something about your actual experience with someone in your life. Not a highlight, not a curated update, but something real about what the week was actually like. Not to burden them, not to overshare, but to practice being seen in small, sustainable increments. Because the window Aristotle described, the capacity for genuine community, does not stay open indefinitely. The longer the walls stand, the more foreign the feeling of being known becomes. The practice of chosen exposure is how you keep that window open.
This week, one specific thing. Think of one person who used to know you better than they do now. Send them one true sentence about how you're actually doing. Not, I'm good. One true sentence. That's it. That's the beginning. Okay, let's bring it all together.
Here's the single truth this entire conversation has been building toward. You cannot fully know yourself alone. Not because you are incomplete, but because identity is not a private object. It is a living thing, and like all living things, it requires relationship to grow. The version of you that exists only inside your own head, unwitnessed and unshared, is not your truest self. It is a draft, and drafts need readers.
What shifted for me in preparing for this conversation is something I hadn't admitted clearly before. I had been proud of my self-sufficiency. I had mistaken it for strength. But self-sufficiency, taken too far, is not strength. It is a refusal to need. And refusing to need is not the same as being free. It is its own kind of captivity.
Regardless of how the walls went up, whether through betrayal, through disappointment, through a slow accumulation of experiences that taught you that being known leads to being hurt, the truth remains. You were made for witness. Proverbs 27:17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another." Not softens, sharpens. The friction of genuine contact with another person is not a threat to who you are. It is how who you are becomes more defined, more clear, more real.
And if you are listening right now from behind walls you have been building for years, walls that look like independence, walls that feel like safety, I want to say something true rather than comforting. The person on the other side of those walls is not the threat. The threat is the version of yourself that nobody ever gets to meet. Because that person, the real one, the unperformed one, deserves to be known, not just by you, by someone who can witness them across time and say, "I see you, and you are worth seeing."
And maybe the deepest wisdom here is not about becoming more open in general, but about choosing carefully the one or two people worthy of your full presence. Not everyone, but someone. Because a life in which no one truly knows you is not a protected life. It is a disappeared one.
What is one true thing about yourself that nobody in your life currently knows? You don't have to share it here, but sit with it, because the fact that it exists, unwitnessed, is the beginning of the conversation worth having. Drop something in the comments. We read them all.
And that brings us to our closing thoughts. Here's what we've walked through together. The modern language of boundaries and privacy, genuinely valuable in its right form, has been quietly weaponized into a philosophy of permanent withdrawal. Aristotle's warning about the buffered self, McAdams' research on the thinning of identity, Cassioppo's loneliness loop, Brown's distinction between being exposed and being known, all of it points to the same urgent truth. The walls designed to protect you may be the very thing preventing you from fully existing.
The most known person isn't the most exposed person. They're the most honest person with one or two or three people who have been granted real access to who they actually are. That is enough. That is everything.
Privacy is not the enemy. Hiding is. And you are too real, too worth knowing to spend your life perfectly hidden, even from the people who would choose you completely if you let them.
Share this episode with someone you've been keeping at arm's length, or someone you know is disappearing behind their own walls. Subscribe to the Wiser Hour if this is the conversation you've been looking for. And tell us in the comments, where do you draw the line between healthy solitude and hiding?
Next week, we're exploring something that runs underneath nearly every form of self-sabotage, the hidden belief that you are not quite allowed to want what you want. That one is going to go deep.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep growing. This is the Wiser Hour.